In today's video, we're talking about HDFC Co-op apartments.
I'm Randall Dolland, a licensed real estate agent, and I'm here to help you navigate the world of New York City's real estate market.
So in this video, we're going to give you all the information that you would need to know about HDFC Co-op apartments, because we're here with Stephane Zwirn of Zwirn Law PLLC. Many years in the business, been doing this for a long time, so she knows exactly what she's talking about and could guide you through the entire process. Right? So Stephane, a lot of buyers want to figure out what are HDFC Co-op apartments, what does the process entail? So tell us about it.
Okay.
What are HDFCs?
Well, very generally, HDFC stands for Housing Development Fund Corporation, and it provides affordable housing for people to purchase homes. It's not referencing the rental units that are affordable, it's purchasing and selling affordable housing units. We're sitting here in Harlem. There's a plethora of HDFCs in Harlem, and the goal is to provide affordable housing for low to middle income people, and also to have buildings that might have been in disrepair come together and produce a fine building. That's always been the goal. So, and it also has tax benefits, which is great. They're most likely to be co-op apartments, and they're sold for less than what, let's say, the market rate would be. So, who's entitled to these? I'm going, who's entitled to these? But who can purchase these? They have to have certain income limits. What HDFC is really looking at is how much does a person make. So the guideline is 120% of the AMI. That's the annual median income for the area. So what I tend to find is if somebody is, and they also gauge it by, are you one person? Are you a family of four? And so what I look at, what I see quite often, although it could vary, is that if you're one person buying an apartment, an HDFC, you can't have more income than about $72,000, which is quite high. So, but we are in New York, and the cost of living is higher here. So let's say you make under $72,000, you should be able to qualify. They really look at your income, not really your assets. So what ends up happening sometimes is that people who, let's say a student who's graduated university, they might not have the money for a $300,000 apartment. They need $30,000 as 10% for their initial deposit. Their parents might supply that, and their income is low enough, they might be eligible to buy it. It's really not intended for people who have family of means so much. But these people do qualify. It's really meant for people of low to moderate income to purchase homes, and then to also sell them. And what's really interesting with HDFC apartments, it's important to note that yes, you have the benefit of purchasing an apartment at a lower rate. However, one day when you go to sell it, there's usually a flip tax associated with the sale. And what's very common is that and they're talking about your profit. So 30% of your profit on the apartment goes back to the co-op. It goes into their reserve fund so that they continue to manage the apartments. And then you get 70%. And when we talk about the profit, what's customarily deducted is you take your sale price and you deduct from it what you originally paid for it. And then often what's allowed is the broker's commission, which could be 6%. Sometimes they allow you to also deduct your attorney's fees, your closing costs, money that you may have put into the apartment to maintain it or improve it. But generally what I see is you deduct the purchase price and you deduct the broker's commission from it. And from that, I've seen, generally it's 70% to the co-op, and 30% to the co-op and 70% to the seller. But I've also seen numbers as high as 70% to the co-op, 30% to the purchaser. So it really varies, and you have to know this when you're purchasing, because it's important for one day when you go down to sell.
Of course, you're going to sell, exactly. So generally, how do HDFCs differ from regular co-ops?
Well, A lot of them can tend to be smaller buildings. So one thing to look out for when you're purchasing in a smaller building is the risk if something breaks. So let's say the boiler breaks in a smaller building, the risk to you to have to pay, let's say it's a 4-unit building, you have to pay 25% to fix that boiler. If it's a 300-unit building, your risks aren't as great. And they tend to be smaller buildings, HDFCs. There are HDFCs that have many units in them, but for the most part, I find them to be smaller to mid-sized buildings. So that's one thing to look at.
So how did HDFC really get started?
It's a very good question. There were a lot of buildings that were just in complete disrepair, and the people that were living in them weren't taking care of them, or the landlords weren't taking them. The city would take over these buildings, and they would offer them back to the people who were living there to purchase them. And back in the 80s, they could purchase apartments for maybe $250, which is phenomenal. And there would be an expectation that they would work on these buildings and build them back up. So a lot of the people that have been living there since the 80s and are now selling them, yes, they will reap the financial reward. It's still sold at a lower than mainstream amount or market rate, but they've put a lot of sweat equity into these buildings, and they've made them look more beautiful. The co-ops function better. Their financials should be better, and that was the intent, was to take these buildings and make them something great and create affordable housing for people.
Right.
So they had a vested interest in it.
So of course it has to be your primary residence.
Yeah, so aside from the income restrictions when you're purchasing an HDFC apartment building, there are some other restrictions, and primarily it needs to be your primary residence. One of the restrictions actually that a new regulatory agreement that de Blasio was initially proposing was, there were a bunch of changes to HDFC that they're proposing and contemplating, but we don't know if they're going to actually happen. But it needs to be a primary residence, meaning that you need to be in this apartment 270 days out of the year, which is actually interesting because it's a more onerous obligation than people who are in rent-stabilized apartments.
Right.
So, people are kind of up in arms about that, but generally it needs to be your primary residence. And also with subleasing, if the intent is that you're supposed to have affordable housing and it's supposed to be your primary residence, it's also, it really shouldn't be subleased so much. So one of the proposed issues in the regulatory agreement was that you would be able to sublease it for 180 days out of a 5-year period. So they're trying to put restrictions on the ability to sublease because, again, you have to go back to the idea of what it's about, create affordable housing for people to live there.
Right.
Another issue that's come up in this proposed regulatory agreement is what else can you own? Are you allowed to own other property?
Right.
So again, going back to, it's supposed to be for people for affordable housing to have homes. So can you have another home, let's say a vacation home out, up in the Catskills or something like that? And the idea is no, you can have other property, but what's being proposed is that it can't be less than 100 miles outside of New York City.
Okay.
So there's a lot of things that are being proposed right now in a regulatory agreement. We're not sure if they're going to go through or not because there's a lot of pushback from it, and that's.
Of course, and that's something that we'll always keep you updated about. What changes are happening in the market as it relates to the HDFCs, and again, that's why we're here as the agent and attorney to answer your questions. But another very common question when it comes to HDFCs is why are they usually all cash?
That's a very good question also. A lot of HDFCs are purchased with all cash. First of all, the number is lower, but then you also have to realize that the people who are purchasing it don't have as much cash to purchase a market rate apartment and would probably likely need financing.
Right.
Banks are reluctant sometimes to loan in HDFC buildings, generally because the way that they could be managed.
Right.
So there are plenty of HDFCs that are managed beautifully and financially sound and kept up, and but then there's other HDFCs that might not be. So a lot of those tend to be the smaller HDFCs. So let's say you have a 12-unit HDFC and it hasn't been managed properly. Banks don't want to lend in places where they're not going to get that's their security. The apartment's actually the security for their loan. So if the building is not being managed properly, that apartment could lose its value. And so banks are reluctant to lend in them. So what's a good idea when you're looking for an HDFC apartment? It's a great idea to make sure that the building you're looking in already is approved by a bank, or that there's already been lending in that building. Well, who is the bank? Who is the banker? That's really who you want to go to, because borrowing for HDFC apartments can be a little bit more complex. Getting the documentation might be harder. The process might move slower. So if you have somebody who's already lent in the building, go to that lender.
Because you have sometimes no minutes available from board meetings and all of that as well.
That's the management issue. Yeah, they're required to have annual, and they're really required to have monthly meetings and take minutes, but a lot of times they won't have them. I've also had scenarios where I've gone to review the minutes. I've made an appointment to go review the minutes and nobody shows up. If that happens, I honestly will sit there and wait until somebody walks through the door, and I will say, okay, I'm here to review the minutes, because it's important. If somebody's not showing up for a minutes review, that's a red flag to me, and I want to make sure I read those minutes. And if there's not minutes, that's a great place where I'll ask questions. So it's important when you're purchasing in an HDFC unit, because there are these other caveats to deal with that you don't have when you're purchasing in a market rate apartment. To have an attorney and to have support that really knows HDFC. In one instance, I would say, if an attorney's not working in HDFC, he might not know something such as, if you're representing the seller, a lot of HDFCs do not have to pay, they're exempt from paying the New York City real estate transfer tax. Generally, it's 1% of the purchase price. So let's say you're purchasing an apartment that's $300,000. You've saved your seller $3,000 that would otherwise just go to the city and you'll never see it again. So it's important to have an HDFC team with you, people who know, so that the agent, the broker, can find the right apartment for you that you know with your income you can get into, and then also that your attorney make sure that you're protected from certain things, and then also that your lender knows how to lend in an HDFC building.
Of course, and that's my job, to make sure that,
it all starts with you.
Exactly, you have the right team. So when you choose me to do it, we get the right team together, lenders, attorneys, to then put the whole transaction together. And of course, every HDFC have their different rules. So like, some have higher limits on income, some lower. So it really depends on what you're looking for, that we can help guide you through that whole process. Stephanie, thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right. And stay in touch with us if you need more information about HDFCs. You can also always reach out to us anytime you need. Thanks for viewing.
Thank you for viewing. Visit my website for more information or subscribe to my YouTube channel.